Bom dia, eu sou Carlos Saltiuk, professor da Universidade de Brasília e coordenador do Laboratório de Antropologia da Ciência e da Técnica, e esse é o segundo seminário Transtec, Transformações Técnicas em Perspectivas Locais. Esse evento integra um programa coletivo de pesquisas que focaliza o seu interesse nas relações técnicas com o objetivo de compreender e sistematizar a variedade das formas de convivência entre humanos e não humanos, que temos chamado de tecnodiversidade. A primeira versão do seminário Transtec, ocorrida em Brasília em 2015, discutiu criticamente a relação entre tecnologia e transformação. Para tanto, um dos focos consistiu em repensar as habilidades e gestos humanos, evitando considerá-los como uma ação sobre o mundo material ou outros seres, mas como uma forma de estabelecer engajamentos ou entrar em ressonância com outras formas de movimento ou fluxo. Isso levou a pensar a pesquisa antropológica como uma forma de aprendizagem. Os resultados desse encontro se expressam no livro Técnica e Transformação, Perspectivas Antropológicas, assim como em artigos e filmes. Esse segundo seminário Transtec efetua um desdobramento dessa agenda, se perguntando mais precisamente sobre as relações de continuidade entre técnica e vida. Essa derivação para o interesse sobre movimento e ecologia, sobre os seres e o meio, nos leva diretamente a interpelar os sentidos e a relevância da antropologia no mundo contemporâneo. Nisso se incluem os desafios conceituais e práticos para redirecionarmos a nossa atenção para além do humano. Hoje temos a satisfação de desfrutar da companhia de um pensador fundamental para essa agenda de pesquisas, que nos influencia há muito tempo e que já esteve conosco em Brasília em 2011. Eu peço a Guilherme Moura Fagundes, pós-doutorando da Universidade de Brasília e que também coordena esse evento, que o apresente.
Obrigado, Carlos. Bom dia a todas e todos. Para a conferência de encerramento do nosso seminário, temos a honra e a satisfação de receber Tim Ingold, um dos principais antropólogos da atualidade. Professor emérito no Departamento de Antropologia da University of Aberdeen, Ingold também leciona cursos junto às interfaces que a nossa disciplina estabelece com a arqueologia, arte e arquitetura. Com vastíssima experiência em pesquisas etnográficas junto a populações do Círculo Polar Ártico, seus escritos sobre as formas de relação com o ambiente tiveram um impacto significativo nos estudos antropológicos sobre os modos de interação com o mundo vegetal, domesticação animal, caça e percepção da paisagem, justamente os temas privilegiados neste seminário. Mais recentemente, seus interesses têm se concentrado num ambicioso exercício propositivo de refundação da nossa disciplina, baseado no que ele nomeia como uma reinserção da antropologia na vida. Ainda em sintonia com o tema deste seminário, seu diálogo criativo com a fenomenologia também se reflete no modo como as atividades técnicas aparecem em seus escritos em estreita correspondência com os fluxos e movimentos vitais. Bom, com isso eu convido vocês a acompanharem a conferência deste incontornável antropólogo contemporâneo, seja para uma antropologia da técnica, seja para uma antropologia da vida, mas sobretudo suas imbricações.
So my talk is called From Habitus to Habit, Reflections on Technique, Body and Voice. The greater part of what we know we cannot explain. This is savoir-faire or know-how. The philosopher Michael Polanyi called it personal knowledge, knowledge that adheres so closely to the person of the practitioner that it cannot be held up to scrutiny or posited as an object of reflection or analysis. Without it, Polanyi argued, nothing could be practicably accomplished. We couldn't tie our shoelaces, beat an egg, hold a pen, or ride a bicycle, but nor for that matter could we design a building, solve an equation, or compose a symphony. In these, as in countless other tasks, we feel our way forward, as Polanyi put it, following a trail and relaying it as we go, instead of executing a predetermined and fully articulated program of explicit rules and representations. It's not that there are no rules at all, but rather than furnishing the pegs that underpin the landscape of action, they more resemble signposts in the landscape itself, which point us in the direction we need to go. They are what we call rules of thumb, offering guidance without specification. In practice, they are more ostensive than prescriptive, and once set upon a course, we rely upon the reservoir of personal knowledge to carry on. To uncover this reservoir, Polanyi believed, it is necessary to strip away the veneer of articulate representations so as he wrote, to lay bare the inarticulate manifestations of intelligence by which we know things in a purely personal manner. What is revealed then, he said, is an immense mental domain, not only of knowledge, but of manners, of laws, and of the many different arts by which man knows how to use, comply with, enjoy, or live by, without specifyingly knowing their contents. Now, here as elsewhere, Polanyi could hardly have been more emphatic that his inquiries had disclosed a realm of mind, a mental domain, the existence of which had previously been unacknowledged, or that until then had not been accorded its due. Yet his discovery was destined to suffer an ignominious fate at the hands of subsequent social theory, which had, albeit belatedly, realized that human beings are only present in the world because they have, or rather are, their bodies. And this realization is commonly traced to an influential essay on techniques of the body, penned by the ethnologist Marcel Mauss in 1934. Drawing attention to the sheer diversity of postures and gestures involved in such everyday tasks as walking, carrying loads, eating and sleeping, Mauss realized that there is more to this than the kind of idiosyncratic variation that marks one individual from another, and that in French would be called habitude. It's not just a matter of what you might happen to pick up, or conversely, what you might improvise for yourself. Some children, as Mauss noted, are more inclined than others to imitate the behavior they observe around them, and yet weak and strong imitators, if they belong to the same society, are similarly educated by example and correction into forms of bodily comportment deemed proper to their age and status. And to denote these forms, socially imposed rather than individually acquired, attributable to education rather than imitation, and thus enshrined in a tradition, Mauss co-opted the Latin term habitus. Now, Mauss's prospectus for a comparative ethnology of techniques of the body was sketchy at best and was soon forgotten by the anthropology of the time. With its fragmentary catalogue of apparently miscellaneous customs from around the world, the essay was so anachronistic in its formulation, and yet so far ahead of its time in terms of the questions it opened up, that it largely fell on deaf ears. And so when some 40 years later, the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu reintroduced the habitus as the cornerstone of a theory of practice centered upon the dispositions of the body, few recalled that he was following the precedent set by Mauss, and nor did Bourdieu go out of his way to acknowledge the fact. And perhaps it is as well that he didn't, since he took the term in a quite different sense. For by habitus, Bourdieu means a kind of practical mastery, a capacity to improvise conduct strategically attuned to the conditions of its production. That is neither picked up haphazardly, as one might pick up an infection simply through personal contact, nor deliberately inculcated through precept and prescription. It is transmitted rather by what Bourdieu highlights as the structural exercises which every society provides for its members. These are exercises in which a body participates not as an instrumental means for the implementation or expression of a moral tradition, but as a productive agent in its own right. Its postures and gestures, far from merely expressing thoughts and feelings already imparted through an education into societal values, are in themselves are in themselves ways of thinking and feeling through which these values are continually reproduced. Now, crucially, according to Bourdieu, the principles of mastery that are passed on by way of these exercises never rise to what he calls the level of discourse. Psychologically, they remain underground, beyond the reach of consciousness. They cannot be articulated or rendered explicit. Ineffable, incommunicable, and therefore inimitable by any conscious effort, these principles are given body, made body, or literally embodied, as Bourdieu puts it, by the hidden persuasion of an implicit pedagogy. Now, so far as I know, Bourdieu makes no reference to the work of Polanyi. He may not even have read it. Yet, with one hugely significant exception, the particular construction that Bourdieu places upon the habitus matches, point by point, what Polanyi claimed for personal knowledge. It cannot be articulated or specified. It is non-propositional and non-declarative. It is acquired and deployed without conscious awareness, yet it nevertheless subtends and makes possible everything we think and do. It's no wonder, therefore, that for the generation of social scientists brought up on Bourdieu, and I am one of them, the temptation is to look back at Polanyi through Bourdieuvian spectacles and to jump to the conclusion that by personal knowledge he meant a knowledge whose proper domain is the body. Indeed, Polanyi has even been criticized in his insistence on the division between personal and articulate knowledge, for reproducing a Cartesian dualism of body and mind. Yet nothing could have been further from Polanyi's intention. As I've already noted, he was emphatic in his verdict that personal knowledge inhabits the mind, belonging to what he called the dimension of the tacit. In distinguishing the tacit from the explicit, he makes it abundantly clear that his concern is to establish a division between two regions of the mind, not between mind and body. But this has not stopped many analysts, influenced by their reading of Bourdieu, from taking tacit and embodied to mean the same thing. The concept of embodied knowledge, as it has entered the received vocabulary of contemporary social science, rests fair and square on this conflation. So in this lecture, I want to take issue with the idea of embodiment by focusing on what I shall call habit, the habit of craftspeople, artisans, musicians, and scholars. And my argument has two components. The first is to show that the habits that enable practitioners to move on in the accomplishment of their tasks are not so much sedimented in the body as generated and enacted in an attentive and kinesthetic correspondence with tools, materials, and environment. And the second is to insist that this is as true of working with words as it is of working with non-verbal materials. To reach the domain of habitual practice, then, does not mean giving up on words or probing beneath them, but it does mean giving up on the techniques of intellectual distillation that allow words to float to the top and habits to sink to the bottom of some imaginary column of consciousness. It's one thing, I contend, to argue that habits resist explication, quite another that they resist verbalization, and that the two have become confused owes much to ambiguities inherent in the notion of the tacit, and it is to these that I turn first of all. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein concluded his celebrated Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus of 1922 with the most austere of pronouncements. "Whereof one cannot speak," he intoned, "thereof one must be silent." Now, taken literally, this injunction would consign to silence all ways of knowing and doing, all wisdom and experience, save that which can be expressed linguistically or mathematically in the form of logically interconnected propositions. Now, just because some things we know remain unspoken, however, does not mean that we can do without them. And it was Polanyi's great achievement to show that knowledge in its articulate expressions amounts to no more than the tip of an iceberg, the overwhelming mass of which lies submerged beneath the waves. And his purpose was not to denigrate this submarine dimension, but to highlight its contribution to thought and practice. As he put it, introducing a set of lectures entitled The Tacit Dimension, we can know more than we can tell. But why did he choose the word tacit to refer to this untold and untellable residue? The word itself is tantalizingly vague. Derived from the Latin tacere, to be silent, it refers in the first place to what remains unvoiced. Yet voiced sounds need not be verbal, and verbal utterances need have no explicit propositional content. What are we to make, for example, of a song without words? And what of an utterance, the force of which is illocutionary, such as an oath, a warning, or a greeting, or a direction? And conversely, of many things that could be stated explicitly, we may prefer to keep our mouths shut for reasons of discretion or security. As the philosopher of science Harry Collins explains in an extended commentary on the tacit-explicit distinction, whether a matter is voiced or even verbal is not really the issue for Polanyi. The tacit for him is not so much the opposite of explicit as of explicable. It consists of things that cannot, by their very nature, be explicated. So, what does Polanyi mean by explication? Two terms keep cropping up in his account of what it entails, namely specification and articulation. To specify means to pin things down to fixed coordinates of reference. To articulate means to join them up into a complete structure. Thus, we specify when we plot dots on a graph, enter values into an equation, or type words on a page. We articulate when we join them up, dots with lines, values with plus or minus signs, words with spaces. And as these examples indicate, explication is not limited to verbal forms. It may also be algebraic or mathematical, or expressed in the peculiar language of symbolic logic. And it may also occur in the conventions of musical notation, where each note is specified by a dot, and where the dots are joined into phrases by ligatures. What do the graph, the mathematical equation, the written sentence, and the scored phrase have in common? Well, they are all absolutely silent. Where everything is pinned down and joined up, nothing can move, and without movement there can be no sound. Specification and articulation, while they may be the keys to logical explication, lock the doors to movement, to sound, and to feeling. They stop it up. This, however, brings us to a rather surprising result. It is that nothing so effectively silences the world than rendering it in explicit propositional terms. Strictly speaking, indeed, it is the explicit that is tacit, not the reservoir of habit or know-how, for which Polanyi reserved the term. Habit, on the other hand, is turbulent and sometimes noisy. It swirls around in between the points that explicit knowledge joins up, like waters flowing around and between the islands of an archipelago. We have been persistently misled, I think, by the analogy of the iceberg, with the picture it presents of explicit knowledge at the tip and the mass of inexplicable know-how below. For far from having come to rest, frozen in submarine psychocorporeal depths, know-how is restless, fluid, and dynamic. Above all, it is not deposited as a stable substrate housed in lower levels of consciousness, but is fundamentally animate, immanent in the sensuousness of a body that is mobile, alive, and open to the world. Such a body, unified not anatomically, but in its affective resonances, far from retreating into silence, dwells in sound. Habits, in short, are not embodied. Rather, the body, in its habitation of a world, is ensounded. Evidently, then, tacit is a misnomer for the dimension of habitual practice. So by what better term should it be known? I'd like to borrow from this purpose a concept from educational theorist Stefano Honi and the literary scholar Fred Moten, namely hapticality. By this they mean, I quote, a feel for feeling others feeling you. In effect, hapticality fills the void of the tacit. Where the tacit is silent, the haptic is noisy. Where the tacit is embodied, the haptic is animate. Where the tacit is sunk into the depths of being, the haptic is open and alive to others and to the world. And with this concept in mind, we can return to Wittgenstein's injunction from the Tractatus. Is the world beyond the shutters of propositional language truly cocooned in silence? Well, try telling that to the birds, the wind, and the waterfall. They may have nothing to say, no facts to pronounce, yet how loudly they proclaim their presence in the world. And it behoves us to listen, for we can tell much from what we hear, whether the birds are calm or agitated, whether the wind is gentle or strong, whether the river is dry or in spate. And if we know the birds by their calls, the wind by the way it rustles the leaves, and the waterfall by the roar of its cascade, then likewise it is by their voices that we know our fellow humans. The voice is the means we human beings have, both of making our presence felt and of feeling the presence of others. It is for us a medium of hapticality. Does hapticality then lie beyond speaking, beyond telling? Is it beyond the shutters while speaking and telling remain closeted within? Well, this could only be true if we were to limit speaking, with Wittgenstein, to logical proposition, or telling, with Polanyi, to articulate expression. Yet in practice, nothing can be proposed or expressed without feeling. There is thus another side to both speaking and telling, a side enacted in performance, in which points of specification take second place to the movements that swirl around and between them. Now, my concern at this stage of the argument is with telling. I'll return to speaking in due course when I move from work to words. For the present, then, let me return to Polanyi's premise, namely that we can know more than we can tell. Now, Polanyi was interested above all in what it means to know. Right now, however, I am more interested in what it means to tell. Is there really no more to telling, I wonder, than explication? Might the capacity to tell, in truth, lie precisely in ways of knowing that overflow the fixity and logical closure of specification and articulation. Well, to tell, of course, can mean many things. It's one of those ancient verbs that comes to us already densely encrusted with significance. Its origins, however, lie in the idea of reckoning or counting. In the past, a teller would be one who keeps a tally, and whose place even to this day would be at the counter or the till. His modern representative, of course, is the accountant. And yet an account rendered in words rather than numbers is a narrative, a story. So what then is the difference between the accountant and the storyteller? The former assembles initially separate point-specific entries into rows or columns. This, as we've seen, is the work of articulation. But the latter, the storyteller, goes along, finding a way between and through the accountant's entry points. Storytellers are wayfarers, and like all wayfarers, they need to attend to things as they go, to recognize subtle cues in the environment and respond to them with judgment and precision. They need to be able to tell, for example, where animals have been from their tracks, or how the weather is about to change, or how the river runs. This is the sense of telling I invoked a moment ago in relation to the birds, the wind, and the waterfall. It is about attention and response. Now, each of these two senses of telling, respectively the recounting of stories and the art of paying attention, entails the other. It is through having their stories told that novices learn to attend to things and to do what they afford in the situations of their current practice. Contrariwise, it is because of the resulting feel for things, that's a kind of intimacy that comes from sharing a life together, that experienced practitioners can tell their stories. Moreover, the capacity to tell in these twinned senses is critical to the practice of any craft. It is perhaps the principal criterion by which the expert can be distinguished from the novice. On the one hand, stories allow experts to tell of what they know without specifying it. The stories carry no information in themselves, no coded messages or representations. They rather offer guidance or directions which less experienced listeners, on finding themselves in a situation similar to that related in the story, can both recognize and follow. On the other hand, by paying attention, experts can tune their movements to the ever-varying conditions of the task as it unfolds. They can tell precisely the right moment at which to make a move, when the forces that bear upon the success of an enterprise are in favorable alignment. This, and not in the practiced ability to execute standard movements with greater speed and or ergonomic efficiency, this is where real skill resides. In both senses, then, craft is a way of telling. It's a way that proceeds not by serial integration, not by adding or joining up what began as discrete, pre-specified entries in the book of accounts, but by joining with others, including the materials with which one works, along with other people and things in the environment. As such, the way of telling abhors explication. It sets nothing down in advance, nor does it project a future outcome in the present. What it does do is offer an itinerary, a path to follow, along which one can keep on going. This is about feeling forward, about anticipation rather than prediction in a circuit of attention and response. Along the way, of course, decisions have to be made, and every decision involves a kind of cut. The cut of telling, however, goes with rather than across the grain of action, not so much dividing it into segments as causing it to veer in one direction or another. Every veer is tantamount to what the philosopher Erin Manning calls an inflection, not a movement in itself, but a variation in the way movement moves. In effect, inflection establishes a differential from within the interstices of a field of practice, along which every practitioner lays down their own recognizable line, as distinct from the lines of others. In the zone of hapticality, in short, telling is a process of what I have called interstitial differentiation. Now, all this attention and response, all these decisions, are surely proof that craft practitioners are thinking. But have you ever wondered why we should think that thinking should be silent, or that it should be invisible? Surely if thinking is not tacit, but as haptic as feeling is, if it is not buried in the body, but overflows into the environment, if it unfolds in the telling, then it can be just as noisy. And we can watch it too. By what curious logic are we led to suppose that while we can watch the gestures of the potter as they caress the clay on the wheel, or hear the bowing of the cellist on the strings, the thought of both the cellist and the potter remains both invisible and inaudible? This logic is perhaps the legacy of a Cartesian division between cognition and action that continues to plague much theorizing on these matters. For with this division, every deliberate action must be preceded by a thought, which it serves to execute. Inevitably then, thought breaks into action, interrupts it, gets in the way. It can even be said to paralyze action, as in the apocryphal story of the millipede, which, when asked how it managed to coordinate the movement of its 1,000 legs, never moved again. Yet manifestly, craftspeople are not paralyzed by thought, for they are perfectly capable of thinking, even of reflecting on what they are doing and of assessing their work without ever breaking away from performance. Reflection, as the anthropologist Anna Portisch writes, is a constitutive aspect of all levels of practice. Now, Portisch pitches her critique against many students of craft practice, myself included, who have argued that the frequent need to reflect on progress or to stop and check is typical of novice practitioners, giving their work a jerky or stop-go character, which gradually disappears with the increasing mastery of the craft. In this view, the more fluent the practitioner, the less reflective the practice. But from her own study of women's crafts in Mongolia, Portisch concludes to the contrary, that reflection and assessment are integral to the practices of integral to the practices of novices and accomplished craftswomen alike. Learning a craft, she argues, is at every level a process that is both dynamic and responsive, involving a continual dialogue with one's environment. Now, I am persuaded by her argument, but I still wonder whether reflection and assessment mean quite the same thing for the novice as for the old hand. It seems to me that the difference lies in the extent to which the practitioner has incorporated the tools and materials of her trade, as whether other salient constituents of the environment, into the dialogue itself. True, the old hand is as thoughtful, as meditative and reflective as the novice, if not more so. But perhaps she is thinking with things more than she is thinking about them, letting them in as accessory to her own reflections. Perhaps her thinking is that of a mind that is not confined within the body, but that extends outwards to include tools, materials, and surrounding conditions, or what the philosopher of cognition Andy Clark calls its wideware. Could the measure of enskillment lie in the distal extension of the mind, radiating outwards from its seat in the body? Well, the answer depends on how we choose to describe the mind. For Clark, the mind is essentially a computational device that works to produce solutions to problems posed by the environment on the basis of information received. But this device may include extrasomatic components. A mathematician, for example, may use pencil and notepad to perform a calculation, and a navigator takes up ruler and compass to plot a course. And so pencil and paper in the one case and ruler and compass in the other are integral to the extended mind of mathematician and navigator, respectively. Now, to explain what he means by the extended mind, and by way of analogy, Clark asks us to consider the prodigious talents of a fish, namely the bluefin tuna. Why, Clark asks, why can the tuna swim so fast? And the answer is that it couples its own bodily energies to the fluid dynamics of the water through which it swims, setting up eddies and vortices through the swishing of its tail and fins, which themselves exert a propulsive momentum beyond any muscular force of which the fish alone is capable. Swimming, then, is an achievement not of the fish alone, but of what Clark calls a swimming machine, comprised by the fish in its proper context. The fish plus the surrounding structures and vortices that it actively creates and then maximally exploits. Thus, it is not strictly speaking the fish that swims, but the fish in the water. It's just the same, Clark suggests, with the mathematician and the navigator. If the totality fish plus eddies plus vortices comprises a mechanism for swimming, so the totality mathematician plus pencil plus notepad, or navigator plus ruler plus compass, comprises a mechanism for computation. The cognitive machine in the human case is extended in just the same way that the swimming machine is for the fish. Or is it? I'm not so sure that swimming can be understood in such mechanical terms. After all, eddies and vortices cannot exactly be connected up like the wheels, cranks, and pistons of an engine in such a way as to deliver propulsion as a motor effect. They are energetic movements in themselves, as indeed is the fish. The fish in the water, indeed, like every other living being in its proper medium, is a whirl. It is not an object that moves, but the emergent form of a movement. Might the fish, then, offer a better analogy for why the thinking that goes into craft practice cannot be understood in computational terms? Perhaps we could say of this thinking too that it is a churning of the mind as it stirs up and is in turn stirred by the sounds and feelings of its milieu. The mind then is not so much a computational device as a vortex in the mix. How else can a potter, armed only with a wheel, turn clay into the myriad forms of jugs and vessels? How can the scribe, armed only with a pen, turn parchment into text? And how can a player, armed only with a cello, make such an immense and variable sound? Not surely because the practitioner's brain, body, and instrument joined together make up a machine, whether for potting, writing, or playing. In practice, the hands of the potter join with the clay in the rotation of the wheel in such a way as to give form to the contours of feeling. It's the same for the scribe, whose every gesture leaves its mark by way of the pen on the writing surface. And, taking up my cello, as I bring my bow into contact with the string, I feel its vibrations under the finger of my left hand as I bow with my right, while the sound gushes out from the unison of breath and gesture with wood, hair, and metal. In every case, be it the potter, scribe, or cellist, the anatomical unity of practitioner plus instrument gives way to a hapticality of sensory awareness and vital materials. It's for this reason that I believe we should resist the temptation to describe mind, body, and world as overlapping fields which in their enlargement are inclined to encroach upon or even encompass each other's domains. The mind is not taken into the body, as conventional appeals to the concept of embodiment tend to imply, nor does it take up the world, as implied by the theory of its extension. The fish in the water gives us a better picture, in my view, of a whirligig world of spiraling movements that run into one another, of thinking spiraling into rounded vessels of clay, into the oscillations of the scribal letter line, into vortices of sound, all of them dynamically sustained formations in the current of life. Well, we have come a long way from Bourdieu and from his understanding of the habitus as a set of dispositions that both generate the mastery of the skilled practitioner and are in turn generated by it, all beneath the radar of conscious awareness. For what we have discovered on the other side of explicit logical articulation is not a lack of awareness, but an awareness of a different kind. It's the awareness of feeling others feeling you, or in a word, of hapticality. And this explains why craftspeople, absorbed into their tasks, by their own report, tend to experience their own presence and movement, and the presence and movement of the persons and things with whom and with which they engage, with heightened rather than diminished intensity. Now, colloquially, the word we use for this is concentration. And by this, we don't mean the kind of cognitive processing that delivers solutions for implementation. It's not the operation of a joined up computational mechanism, whether inside the head or extending beyond it. Concentration lies rather in the affective unison of haptic and kinesthetic awareness with the movement and vitality of materials. Now, the recognition of this other form of awareness, concentrative rather than cognitive, haptic rather than explicit, at last offers a way of resolving a question to which the answer has long eluded us. For there is no doubt that many things we routinely do involve no concentration at all. We are often scarcely aware we are doing them. With these operations, the more practiced we are at them, the less thought and attention they demand of us. They are markedly unresponsive to surrounding conditions, to the extent that if conditions change, they can break down and lead us astray. They seem virtually automatic. Now, in principle, automatic operations could be done just as well by a machine, and indeed in the history of technology, they have often been among the first to be mechanized. The question is, how are we to distinguish such automatisms from the practiced mastery of a craft? Now, if no other awareness were possible, save that which reflects and reports on practice from the outside, which intrudes into it and holds it to account, then we would risk reducing craft practice to the level of bodily automatism. It would be negatively characterized by the absence of conscious deliberation. And to an extent, this is precisely what has happened in social scientific writing on embodiment and the tacit dimension. You would think from reading much of this literature that there is not much difference between touch typing and performing a Rachmaninoff piano concerto. It may be that the latter is a lot more difficult and takes a great deal of practice, that none but the most dedicated musician would willingly endure. In both cases, however, we are led to believe that it is all a matter of leaving the fingers to take care of themselves, freeing the mind for higher things. But if the pianist is truly thinking with his fingers, if his thought flies with the sound of the keys, if he feels the presence of listeners whose ears stretch to catch every passing sound, and if he and they are truly moved by the experience, then there is all the difference in the world between his performance and, say, that of a player piano that has been mechanically programmed to reproduce the same piece. And the difference is simply this. The master pianist's performance unfolds along a way of telling, the machine performance does not. All true craft, as I have endeavored to show, is a way of telling. The ossification of telling in the language of embodiment, its reduction to a kind of sediment, has its parallel in the way we tend to speak of habit. It has become common to treat as habits the things we do unthinkingly and without consideration. They are often regarded as the unwanted detritus of ordinary activity, behaviors that have fallen out of active commerce with the world and become stuck in repetitive patterns or even addictions that may have meant something once but no longer have significance today. They do not require to be learned so much as unlearned, and usually they are judged to be bad. When did you last hear anyone talking about their good habits? But I believe there is more to habit than this, for it's a word that speaks more affirmatively of custom, of use, of dress, of care, and even of virtue. Indeed, this latter sense of habit, as inherently virtuous rather than addictive, has a long and distinguished pedigree in Western thought, going back to Aristotle, continued by Hegel, and culminating in Félix Ravaisson's famous essay of 1838, Of Habit. And yet, according to the philosopher Catherine Malabou, in a recent preface to Ravaisson's work, his great achievement was to show how there cannot be one sense of habit without the other, how the very recognition of habit as rote repetition depends on habit in the other sense, as a power of beginning, thanks to which repetition comes to be perceived as difference. The difficulty with the concept of habit has always been to decide where to place the doer. Are we, so to speak, in front of our habits or behind them? Do we make our habits or do our habits make us? The problem arises so long as we are forced to choose between the active and the passive voice of the verb, that is, between what we do and what we undergo. But in his reflections on art as experience, the philosopher John Dewey argued that we would do better to understand habit in terms of the relation between the two. Neither in front of what we do nor behind it, we are in the midst. Our doing is also our undergoing, and what we do is also done in us. In our intercourse with the world, Dewey explained, we also inhabit the world, or in a word, we dwell in habit. And this perhaps is as good a definition as any of what it means to practice a craft. A way of telling is also a way of dwelling, of inhabiting, which, far from remaining stuck in a groove of endless repetition, continually reopens to new possibilities of use. So I would like to think of habit, like craft, as a way of telling. But with the principle of habit, moreover, telling is also using. To use something, after all, is to draw it into your habitual or usual pattern of activity. Both you and it work together as brothers in arms, to joint effect. And conversely, to be used to a thing is to accept it into your life as part of your custom. For the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, habit is first and foremost what he calls use of oneself, in which the user puts their very existence at stake by allowing it to be affected, even constituted, by the thing used. Thus, as Agamben writes, human being and world are in use in a relationship of absolute and reciprocal immanence. And this is how habitual use differs from utilization. For to utilize a thing is not to put one's existence at stake at all, but rather to repudiate any affective involvement or common feeling. The protection of the self behind the triple lock of eyes, ate, and eon, as in utilization, ensures that the instrument and what it touches are held at arm's length, eliminating any possibility of cross-infection between human being and world. Utilization, however, is the modus operandi of explication and articulation, not that of telling. Things become instruments of telling only in their use. And when the things we use are words, our ways of telling become ways of speaking. And with this, I come to the final part of my argument, in which I shift my focus from works to words. Words are the habit, the dress of human life. For most of us, as we go about our business, they furnish our principal means of telling. With words, we invite others to gather round, converse with them, join our own life stories with theirs, attend and respond to what they say and do. Our words can be noisy or quiet, turbulent or serene, enriched by the patina of everyday use, ever varying in texture. They can caress, startle, enchant, repel. In speech, they well up on the breath, their sounds sculpted by movements of the tongue and lips. The words of a signed language are no less animate, although formed by gestures of the arm, hand, and fingers rather than the voice. And it's not just that I speak or sign, for my speaking speaks me into life, into being, and so too my signing signs me. Whether spoken or signed, my words bring me into the presence of others with ears to listen or eyes to observe, who know me by my voice and gesture for the being I am. Even in writing, words spill out onto the page as the hand, now hesitating as it waits for coming thought, now racing to catch up with it, leaves a meandering trail in its wake. And while I might write unobserved, the traces that my hand leaves upon the page, when they eventually meet the eyes of the reader to whom they are addressed, can nevertheless rekindle the feeling that went into their formation. In every case, whether spoken, signed, or handwritten, words are performed in bodily practice and burst into the zone of hapticality. Why then, in the writings of social and cultural theorists, are words so often expelled from this zone, as if they had no business there? Why should they be consigned to the space of inanimate articulation? We are repeatedly told that words can never take the measure of feeling, that they can offer at best a stunted window on the reality of bodily experience, and that we have to go behind the words or beneath them if we are to plumb this experience to its depth. In the eyes and minds of theorists, words have been stripped of their power to move, to affect, or to evoke. They have instead become tools of the intellect, utilized rather than used, wholly given over to projects of explication. Drained of feeling, removed from the tumult of performance, and barred from contact with the things of which they speak, words find themselves imprisoned in the silent seclusion of what they're supposed to stand for, namely concepts. But words cannot be held to blame for their own incarceration. The blame lies rather in the suppression, above all by an academic establishment anxious to defend its authority in matters of representation, the suppression of those very voices that inhabit the word, that breathe life into language and cause it to tremble. Like all other organisms, human beings must breathe to stay alive. They breathe alternately in and out. The voice, however, is carried only on the out-breath. In a society such as our own, in which fluent, articulate speech is viewed as the supreme index of intelligence, the out-breath tends to be relatively prolonged and the in-breath foreshortened, so as to reduce pauses to a minimum and not to interrupt the flow. Of course, the pauses are there, but we are trained to conceal them, lest we should appear lazy, hesitant, or indecisive. There is nothing universal, however, about this effort to conceal the pause. It is rather a historical consequence of the modelling of speech as literate articulation, that is, as an enchainment of letters and words into rigid syntactic structures. In this model, the pause is an unproductive gap that should ideally be closed. It is considered unproductive because all the thinking, which the words are meant to convey, is assumed to have already been done by a cognitive machine that sits atop the apparatus of speech and delivers its outputs for execution. This assumption, as we've seen, is shared even by cognitive theorists such as Clarke, who would extend the mind beyond the compass of the brain to include the body in which it is housed and the world in which both brain and body subsist. The extended mind, in the view of these theorists, is a cognitive engine with the logical connectivity of a machine, the operation of which is undisturbed by the aerial currents that swirl around and in between its interlinked parts. It is the machine, now including somatic and extrasomatic components, that does the thinking, leaving the voice on the out-breath to manage the speaking, and the in-breath with nothing else to do than reload with air. Thinking, then, is speechless, and speaking thoughtless. In our experience, however, thinking cannot be thus cut off from the life-sustaining process of respiration. Rather, we think even as we breathe. The pause on the in-breath is itself a pause for thought, where to think is to feel, to pay attention to things, to gather the forces and energies of one's surroundings, to recollect and prepare. It is, quite literally, to draw inspiration, to breathe in as one is breathed upon. And on the out-breath, in turn, this pent-up feeling, modulated by the voice, vents into the zone of hapticality. Here, in inspiration and expiration, the muscular heave of the lungs merges with the cadences of the voice, with speech and song, and with thinking. All are together on the same plane of being, in the spiraling currents of mind, body, and world. Now, that breathing is a bodily process goes, of course, without saying. It is another matter altogether, however, to say of the practices of breathing, of the practice of breathing, that it is embodied. Literally, the M of embodiment signifies an implosion, deposition, or incorporation, whereupon the body folds in on itself. And this is the very opposite of breathing. For on the out-breath, the body gives out to the world rather than taking it in, and were it prevented from doing so, were the intake of breath to settle inside, why the body would suffocate. It is precisely in its suffocation at the hands of social theory, albeit not literally but figuratively, that words and muscles part company, appearing in separate registers of verbal cognition and behavioral sediment. As words are raised to the pinnacle of self-consciousness, so bodily practice sinks to the silent depths of unconscious automatism. And the result is the opposition between verbalization and embodiment, the one allegedly explicit, the other tacit, that so much academic analysis has taken as its starting point. My objective, to the contrary, has been to restore both words and habits, ways of speaking and ways of telling, to hapticality. Habits are no more sedimented in the body than words are liberated from it. Rather, both words and habits are animate, carried forth in the breath of life. Thank you very much.
Olá, estão me ouvindo? Bom, gostaria de agradecer ao Tim pela maravilhosa conferência, como de hábito. Ele reconfigura aqui de maneira brilhante a clássica dicotomia entre palavras e gestos, pensamento e prática, explicação e atuação, que é um tema central para as abordagens sobre técnica e vida que nós temos discutido nesse seminário. Essas são as reflexões que ele tem preparado para o seu próximo livro, que o Tim gentilmente aceitou apresentar aqui para o diálogo com o público que nos assiste nesse momento. Nós vamos adotar nesse debate uma dinâmica bilíngue entre português e inglês, para a qual nós vamos contar com o auxílio do Luiz Costa, professor da UFRJ. Eu aproveito para agradecer ao Luiz e também pelo trabalho de legendagem da Carolina Selvatiti. Luiz, você quer fazer a primeira tradução já, antes da gente passar para as questões?
Sim, thank you. Carlos would like to thank Tim for his habitually wonderful conference. Tim reconfigures in a brilliant manner the classic dichotomy between words and gestures, thought and practice, explication and performance, which are central themes for the approaches to technique and life that we have been discussing in this seminar. These reflections, which have been prepared for his forthcoming book and which Tim has kindly presented to us for discussion at this event. In the debate, we will adopt a bilingual dynamic shifting between Portuguese and English, counting on the help of Luís Costa, professor at the University of Rio de Janeiro. I would also like to thank Carolina Selvatiti for the subtitles.
Obrigado, Luiz. Vamos começar então pela primeira questão do Eduardo de Deus. Eduardo.
Ok, obrigado, Carlos. Queria dizer que é uma honra estar participando desse evento com o Tim Ingold, que é um antropólogo que muito nos influencia há tanto tempo aqui. E, enfim, na verdade são duas questões bem curtas, né? Primeiramente, eu queria pedir para o professor Ingold falar um pouco mais sobre como as reflexões sobre o hábito que ele nos trouxe hoje impactam uma antropologia da aprendizagem e da educação, no sentido de como abordar esses fenômenos, né, de como nos dirigir a eles. E também eu fiquei me perguntando, a partir dos exemplos mais do campo, enfim, de ofícios artesanais, se ele podia trazer alguma palavra sobre como o hábito abre caminho para a gente pensar em engajamentos com máquinas em contextos industriais ou até mesmo agroindustriais. Muito obrigado.
Eduardo de Deus of the University of Brasilia. He'd like to thank Tim for the conference and ask two short questions. First, he wants to know, Tim, how your thoughts on habit would affect an anthropology of learning and education, and the sense of how we would be able to approach these phenomena, address ourselves to them. He'd also like to know, in relation to the field of the studies of craft, how habit can open up a way for us to think of engagements with machines in industrial contexts, and even in agro-industrial contexts.
Thank you. I just making a note of the questions. Yes, right. On the first question, how could the idea of habit inform an anthropology of learning and education? I've tried to develop a broader understanding of what habit is, which would allow us to see it as something positive, constructive, and virtuous, rather than just an automatic or addictive process. Luís.
Então, primeiro, ele buscou desenvolver um conceito de hábito mais ampla, que seja algo positivo, construtivo e virtuoso também. Então, não um processo simplesmente automático ou viciante.
So if we develop an idea of learning and education as learning through doing, through undergoing various kinds of experience, then habit would become quite central to the educational process, rather than something marginal or something to be discounted.
Então, se a gente desenvolver o aprendizado e a educação como um aprender ao fazer, né, ao sofrer tipos de experiência, o hábito se torna central, então, para uma compreensão do processo educacional, e não algo a ser relegado ou algo secundário a esse processo.
So yes, I think that we could actually make habit and habituation an important part of a learning process.
Então, sim, ele acha que a gente pode fazer do hábito e da habituação uma parte importante do processo de aprendizagem.
Now, to the second question about our engagement with machines and in industrial or agricultural contexts, I think my answer is I don't want to make a huge, although I was talking about craft, I don't want to make a huge distinction between craft activities and machinic activities.
Então, em relação à segunda questão sobre máquinas em contextos industriais e agroculturais, embora ele estivesse falando de ofício, ele não quer fazer uma grande distinção entre o ofício e esse tipo de trabalho mais mecânico.
So I think somebody who is operating a machine is also a skilled person who has incorporated the ways of working of that machine into their own modus operandi.
Então, alguém que opera uma máquina também é uma pessoa com habilidade, que incorpora os modos de funcionamento dessa máquina no seu próprio modus operandi.
So perhaps we need to humanize machines and to see the machine not as an alien entity, but as something that we can deal with and relate to as we would relate to other things.
A gente precisa humanizar as máquinas, né, e não vê-las como entidades alienígenas, mas como coisas com as quais nós relacionamos, assim como relacionamos com outras coisas.
Thanks.
Obrigado, Tim. Vamos ouvir agora a segunda questão, que é do Ludovic Kupai. Ludo, pode abrir o vídeo.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this wonderfully philosophically inspired and philosophically inspiring conference. And that goes with a lot of things that I've been thinking. So I've got, in fact, two questions. One is more sort of related to the anthropological edition. Don't stop here for Luís.
Então, o Ludovico agradece pela conferência, que é filosófica. Ele tem duas questões. A primeira, que é mais ligada às implicações antropológicas, se eu bem entendi.
So, I found many of your points resonating with some of the work that have been done exactly on that aspect of the nonverbal. And I was, my first question was, how would you think, or what is your thinking of the similar points or key points that have been made by André Leroy-Gourhan on this idea of the operational memory, very Bergson and Vitalis inspired, and on one hand, and the other one, another musicians also who wrote on that, which is Richard Sennett. I think he was a violinist who made like very similar also point on the non-verbal on his book, The Craftsman. And I'll stop there, and then I've got a final question.
Então, o Ludovic disse que achou muitos dos pontos que o Tim Ingold levantou ressoam com o trabalho dele sobre o não verbal, sobre aquilo que não é dito. E ele pergunta ao Tim como ele pensa sobre pontos parecidos feitos por... não sei o nome do autor, mas também é sobre memória operacional e também sobre outro músico, sim, Richard Sennett, que fez alguns pontos parecidos, levantou pontos parecidos sobre o lugar do não verbal.
O Ludovic falou do André Leroy-Gourhan, é o autor que ele citou.
Yeah.
Okay. Go on, Ludo.
Yeah, and the last point, I think it's very important. You talked about the virtue of habit, but I would like to know more about how we can use what you described to also reveal the vernacular morality that might be contained within those practices. Thank you.
Então, e a segunda questão, o último ponto, é que o Tim falou da virtude do hábito, mas o Ludovic quer saber como usamos aquilo que o Tim descreve para descobrir moralidades vernaculares que são contidas, que podem estar contidas nessas práticas.
Okay. André Leroy-Gourhan is something of a hero of mine. I am a great admirer of his work and have been hugely influenced by it. But he's not always consistent. And there's one particular side of Leroy-Gourhan that I have found most inspiring. Luis, maybe.
O Tim diz que o Leroy-Gourhan é uma espécie de herói dele. Ele sempre foi um grande admirador do trabalho do Leroy-Gourhan e foi muito influenciado por ele. Mas ele acha que o Leroy-Gourhan nem sempre é consistente. E tem um lado em específico do autor que o inspira.
That aspect is when Leroy-Gourhan is always placing the technical human in the sphere of practical activity. The human is always doing something, and Leroy-Gourhan is always understanding how, when he's talking about tools or anatomy or whatever it is, he's always starting from the human engaged in an activity, and that's his starting point, and that is my starting point as well.
E, então, esse aspecto que me inspira é que quando o Leroy-Gourhan coloca o humano técnico na esfera da atividade prática, ou seja, o humano sempre faz algo e o Leroy-Gourhan sempre entende, seja ele está falando de artefatos ou de anatomia, ele sempre parte do humano engajado em uma atividade. É aí que ele começa, esse é o ponto de partida dele, e o Tim diz que é o ponto de partida dele, do próprio.
So the way he's talking about memory, that actually you remember by doing things, that in doing something you're also remembering how to do it. That is operational memory, and that is something I entirely accept. Maybe then I'll talk about Sennett.
Então, ele como Leroy-Gourhan fala sobre memória, como nós lembramos, né, recordamos ao fazer coisas, e ao fazer coisas recordamos também. Isso é que ele chama de memória operacional, e é algo que o Tim aceita como princípio.
Richard Sennett is slightly different. Richard Sennett is a cellist, like me. We are both cellists, and I've often found that when I'm thinking the same way as somebody else, or when somebody else really understands what I'm trying to say, it always turns out in data discussion that they also play the cello.
Então, ele diz que o Richard Sennett é um músico, ele toca violoncelo, que nem o Tim também toca violoncelo. E ele, quando ele pensa como outro, e o outro entende o que ele quer dizer, ele sempre descobre depois que essa outra pessoa que o entende também toca o violoncelo.
So there is something about this instrument, the cello, that must facilitate a certain way of thinking or promote a certain way of thinking. And I do think with my cello, and so does Richard Sennett.
Então, tem algo sobre esse instrumento que facilita uma certa maneira de pensar, ou promove uma certa maneira de pensar. E Tim diz que ele pensa com o seu violoncelo e que o Richard Sennett também pensa com o seu violoncelo.
But I'm not such an admirer of Richard Sennett's work on the craftsman as I am of Le Ragueron. I think for two main reasons. One reason is that I think it is derivative. He writes as though he's discovering the whole field of material culture studies, completely ignoring all the work that has been done by people like yourself and many others in the process. So that's one problem.
Então, mas ele diz que não admira tanto aquilo que o Richard Sennett escreve sobre o artesão da maneira como ele admira o que o Leroy Gorin escreve, por duas razões. O primeiro é que é um trabalho derivativo, né? O Richard Sennett escreve como se ele estivesse descobrindo todo esse campo de estudos de cultura material, ignorando todo um campo de estudos, inclusive o estudo do próprio Ludovic, que tratam desses temas também.
The other trouble is that I think he presents a sanitized and romantic view of craftsmanship. I was talking to some craftspeople a few years ago, shortly after the publication of his book, and they were very cross because they said that in his book there is no waste material, there is no physical hardship, there is no occupational disease. They said, if you're a working craftsman, you suffer often all sorts of illnesses because of your work, and you breathe in dust. It's not so beautiful.
E o segundo problema é que ele apresenta uma versão sanitizada, né, romântica do ofício e do artesão. O Tim falou com alguns artesãos depois do livro do Richard Sennett ser publicado, e eles estavam um pouco chateados, porque no livro do Sennett não expressava a dureza do trabalho com artesanato, o sofrimento, as doenças que fazem parte, a poeira que você ingere e assim por diante.
And your last question about vernacular morality, many anthropologists and others, I think, have argued that craft is fundamentally an ethical practice. Now, that's not something that I dwelt on particularly in this paper, but I would not disagree with it. That is to say that there is an ethical, I think I would call it an ethical rather than a moral dimension to a way of being responsibly with materials. It's a form of care.
Então, a última questão sobre a moralidade vernacular. Então, muitos antropólogos argumentam que o ofício é uma prática ética. Isso não é algo sobre o qual você me falou muito nessa apresentação, mas ele também não discorda dessa colocação. No entanto, ele diz que é uma dimensão, ele chamaria de uma dimensão ética, mais do que uma dimensão moral, mas ela está implícita em se estar responsavelmente com os materiais, porque é uma forma de cuidado.
I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, if you don't mind, can we put together groups of questions?
Yeah, no, that's okay. Fine. I'll just make notes as we go so that I remember them.
Thank you. So, Jorge Luan, por favor.
Oi, bom dia, vocês me ouvem? Eu sou Jorge Luan, sou professor de Antropologia na Universidade Estadual Vale do Acaraú e, enfim, tenho uma pergunta para fazer. Bom, normalmente, quando nós falamos sobre, descrevemos a questão dos sentidos e da percepção, nós tendemos a pensar sobre tudo em termos da visão e da audição e, enfim, em menor grau sobre o cheiro. Mas como pensar e descrever etnograficamente a percepção que se dá a partir da pele, do tato, naquilo que, enfim, você não toca, o que não te toca diretamente? Vou exemplificar. Os caçadores que eu pesquiso são um grupo camponês no Nordeste do Brasil, interceptam as mensagens do dono da caça, que se comunica com os animais e com os próprios caçadores a partir de assovios, tanto os ouvindo quanto sentindo os pelos arrepiarem e a pele esfriar. Digo isso, sobretudo, pensando que essa dimensão tátil me parece mais difícil de traduzir etnograficamente com palavras. Obrigado.
Okay, this is Luan, a professor at the University of Vale do Acaraú. And his question is that normally, when we speak when we talk of and describe the feelings and perceptions, we tend to think, above all, in terms of vision and hearing, and to a lesser degree, smell. But when we think and describe ethnographically the perception which occurs through the skin, through touch, and that which you touch, and what that doesn't touch you directly, I mean, what happens then? And the hunters he researches, which is a peasant group from the northeast of Brazil, they intercept messages from the owners of the game, which and the owner of the game communicates with animals and with the hunters themselves through whistling, both by listening to them and by feeling their skin standing on the goosebumps, their skin getting goosebumps and going cold. So he's saying, above all, he's thinking in this tactile dimension, which seems more difficult to translate ethnographically into words. And he wonders if you have any thoughts on that.
Obrigado, Luiz. Nós vamos ouvir agora o Fábio Moura e depois o time responde. Fábio.
Bom dia.
Fábio?
Sim?
Agora sim.
Agora sim. Bom, bom dia a todas e todos. Aqui é para Tim. Agradecer em primeiro lugar pela maravilhosa, instigante conferência. E eu sou Fábio Moura, né, sou professor da Universidade Federal da Paraíba, nordeste do Brasil. E eu queria um pouco recuperar, foi antecipado pelo Ludovic, algumas questões relativas a Realização, que eu acho que isso nos dá, digamos assim, uma conexão bastante importante das coisas que o time está colocando, o Tim Ingold está colocando para a gente. E, em específico, sobre o gesto e a palavra de Realização, queria, de alguma maneira, ver se o time podia falar um pouco sobre o papel do ritmo. O que quero dizer com isso? Porque no comportamento operatório, mais que a ênfase sobre a questão da memória operatória, o Realização ele coloca uma relação entre um comportamento operatório lúcido e outro maquinal, não como sendo dicotômicos ou hierárquicos, mas como sendo um contínuo entre eles, e essa continuidade se dá justamente através dessa dimensão rítmica. Então, essa é um pouco uma pergunta. Qual é o papel do ritmo na habitualidade, a habitualidade que ele está, de alguma maneira, propondo como compreensão desses capacetes? Essa é a primeira. Depois tem uma outra que sim, bem rápido.
Tim, this is Fábio Moura of the University of Paraíba, and he wants to sort of go back to a question that Ludovic anticipated in a way, which concerns the work of Leroy-Gorin. There's an important connection between what you're saying, Tim, and some of what Leroy-Gorin is saying, particularly in his book Gesture and Word, I believe it's called in English. So he would like Tim to speak of the role of rhythm. More than an emphasis on memory, Leroy-Gorin places a relation, he establishes a relation between lucid operations and mechanical operations, which he views as being continuous. And the continuity between them seems to occur through rhythm. So his question would be where you would situate rhythm in habituality as you describe it.
E a outra, sim, e a outra é sempre relacionada a isso, dentro dessa dimensão rítmica, e a papel principalmente da questão da dimensão da palavra e da narração, que eu estava falando, que papel joga a variação? A variação também a partir de estratégias, né, de escolhas, né? Era isso. E muito obrigado.
And the second question is, within the rhythmic dimension, and going back to the matter of word and of narrative, what role would you say that variation plays? Variation as strategy and choice.
Okay, Tim, you can respond now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right, on the first question, I'm sorry I didn't catch the name of the questioner, but it was a question about the relationship between vision, hearing, touch, possibly smell as well. It was Jorge, right? Yeah. In, for example, communications between hunters and spirit owners of the game, where in that case, as I understood it, if you're a hunter, you feel the presence of a spirit in your body. You feel it in the goosebumps on your flesh, in whistling that you hear, and so on. In talking about hapticality, I wanted it to embrace everything rather than to limit it to any particular sensory modality. So, Luis, maybe
Então, em relação à questão do Luan sobre visão, tato, olfato, bom, pelo que ele entendeu, na comunicação entre caçadores e os donos da caça, se você é o caçador, você sente a presença do espírito em seu corpo, nos arrepios, no assovio que você escuta. E sem ao falar de hapticalidade, ele queria englobar tudo, na verdade, não se limitar a certas dimensões sensoriais.
My feeling is if you're a hunter, then all your senses are very alert, very on edge, and you wouldn't start analyzing your experience as to what extent is it smell or touch or vision or hearing. This would be perhaps in a later analysis, but in the event, it's all wrapped up together in a way in which another being is present to you in the world.
Então, a impressão que ele tem é que se você é um caçador, todos os seus sentidos estão em alerta, eles estão ligados, né? E você não começaria a analisar a sua experiência se perguntando em que medida o que está ocorrendo é toque, ou é audição, ou é olfato. Talvez depois, no outro momento, você analise dessa forma, mas no evento, tudo isso ocorre junto com o seu engajar no mundo.
I think my main point is that these are not embodied so much as the body is itself launched on this current of awareness, which is something that goes on among and between beings, not within them.
Então, o ponto central dele é que essas coisas não são tão incorporados, mas que o corpo é colocado em uma corrente de atenção, e que essa coisa ocorre entre os seres e não aos seres.
So it's a body opening itself up to the world, which to my mind is the opposite of embodiment.
É corpo se abrindo ao mundo, que na visão dele é o oposto da incorporação, do embodiment, né?
Now, on Fabio's two questions, the first question was about rhythm, which is indeed, rhythm is absolutely central to, it's one part actually of that work, La geste et la parole, the gesture and speech by Le Rogueron. Where would I put rhythm within hapticality? And it's true that I didn't actually refer explicitly to rhythm, but the answer to the question, I think, is in your second question. That is that rhythm is not a movement, it is a relation between movements.
Então, a pergunta do Fábio sobre ritmo, de fato o ritmo é central e é uma parte, na verdade, uma das partes centrais do gesto e palavra do Leroy Gouvin. Então, a pergunta para o Tim, onde ele colocaria o ritmo na hapticalidade? Realmente ele não se referiu a isso na fala, mas ele acredita que a resposta a essa pergunta está justamente na segunda questão que o Fábio colocou a ele, que o ritmo é uma relação entre movimentos.
If you remember Henri Lefebvre's book on rhythm analysis, where he argues that that rhythm is not repetition. You only get rhythm when there is repetition with difference. Or we can use the word variation, it's the same thing. So actually it's when you get repetition with variation that gives you rhythm. And I think Le Courant says much the same thing.
Então, pegando o trabalho do Lefebvre sobre análise de ritmo, lá fica claro que o ritmo não é a repetição. Você só tem ritmo quando você tem repetição com diferença ou com variação, vai dar no mesmo. Então, repetição com variação te dá o ritmo, cria o ritmo, e o Le Courant diz isso também.
Ok.
Thank you, Tim. Vamos então ouvir agora a pergunta da Magda. Magda, por favor.
Bom dia a todos. Bom dia, Tim. Agradeço por essa fala, muito bom te ver novamente, na verdade te ouvir, né? Mais do que te ver, te ouvir contar também, mais do que explicar, né? E a minha pergunta diz respeito a essa noção da vitalidade material, que você traz aqui, também em outros textos, mas aqui quando você mencionou a vitalidade material, você falou de uma outra forma de consciência, né? E estou pensando aqui em discussões desse nosso encontro sobre o universo das plantas, o universo da botânica, dos vegetais, e como é que essa outra forma de consciência estaria dispersa, né? Ali nas relações e nas conexões para além do corpo, né? Então, estou entendendo essa forma que estaria desincorporada, digamos assim. E aí, pensando na apticalidade, eu queria te ouvir mais sobre esse problema que a gente enfrenta também ligado ao método, né? Qual a forma, né? A melhor forma do método, ou melhor colocando, né? De que maneira podemos repensar os nossos métodos para conseguir dialogar com essa outra forma de consciência a partir da apticalidade. Obrigada.
So this is Magda, I think of the University of Minas Gerais, who says it's nice to see you again and hear you. She's very pleased to hear you again. And she wants to ask you a question about material vitality, which you discuss here in another work. And when you mentioned it in your speech today, you mentioned another form of consciousness. And this made her think of some of the other events we've had in the seminar, particularly where plants were discussed, and how these other forms of consciousness are extended or dispersed beyond the body. They're disembodied in a way. And in relation to hapticality, she has a question concerning the problem we face in relation to method. So what is the best way or the best method, the best way for us to rethink our methods so that we can enter into discussion with this other form of consciousness?
Ok, vamos ouvir uma segunda questão do Rodrigo. E aí voltamos para a resposta do Ingold. Rodrigo.
Olá, pessoal. Obrigado, professor Tim Ingold, pela palestra tão inspiradora. A minha pergunta é muito simples, na verdade. Te ouvindo, enfim, fiquei bastante tocado pela maneira como se articula a apticalidade, enfim, questiona esses temas clássicos, e também bastante contemporâneos, né, que sempre voltam para a gente. Eu fiquei pensando muito no lugar da inovação para pensar esse esquema que você está propondo. É isso, queria te ouvir um pouco, se possível. Obrigado, gente.
Rodrigo, thanks you, and he has a simple question. He says he was touched by the way you articulate hapticality and themes which are always classic and contemporary as well. And what he thought of in relation to your speech was of the place of innovation and where innovation would sit in your scheme.
Okay. Very simple question, very difficult. Shall I answer now, or do you want more questions?
Please go on.
Okay, so Magda's question first. It's a question about consciousness and material vitality and how I think it's a question of how we think consciousness beyond the body. I obviously do want to think consciousness beyond the body because I I actually I want to rethink the body. It's the body that is the more. I think the body is the problem, not consciousness, because of the way we still tend to think of the body in a very almost objective way.
Então, em relação à pergunta da Magna, que é sobre consciência, vitalidade e moral, como pensamos da consciência para além do corpo, o Tim diz que ele, definitivamente, ele quer pensar a consciência para além do corpo, mas ele quer repensar o corpo. O problema para ele está no corpo e não na consciência, porque nós pensamos o corpo, acabamos sempre pensando o corpo de modo quase objetivo.
Because in my work, I've found that I want to think more about the soul. And not the soul in the way perhaps it's understood in standard Christian theology, but more as it's understood by indigenous people, and think about consciousness in relation to the soul rather than the body, and to think of the soul as the way in which the vital world into which our existence is thrown is wound up inside us, so that the soul is the memory we have within us of the vital currents from which we were formed.
Então, no trabalho dele, ele quer pensar mais sobre a alma, mas não a alma como ela é compreendida na teologia cristã padrão, mas como ela é compreendida por muitos povos indígenas. Então, consciência em relação à alma e não o corpo. E a alma como modo no qual o mundo vital em que estamos inseridos se amarra dentro de nós. De maneira como o mundo vital, a alma como uma espécie de registro da memória desse nosso lugar no mundo vital.
There's a lovely place in one book by Michel Serres, where he says that the soul is a vortex. It's a vortex in the like an eddy in a river, and maybe we could think about consciousness in that, using that kind of image, where the body really doesn't help.
Ele tem uma passagem num trecho do Michel Serres em que ele define a alma como um vórtex, né, como um redemoinho num rio. Ele acha que a consciência pode ser pensada assim, como um vórtex, e ele acha que o corpo não ajuda muito aqui.
And then on your second question about methods, this is another very big question, but method literally means, from the Greek, a way of going beyond. Hodos, which is way, and meta, which means beyond. So the method is actually trying to find a way that we can move beyond where we are now.
Então, a segunda questão sobre o método é uma questão grande também, evidentemente, e eu sempre chamo a atenção que método, em grego, vem de uma palavra grega que literalmente quer dizer uma maneira de ir além. Então, o método é achar um jeito de nós irmos para além do lugar onde estamos no momento.
But that means if we have our methods, the people we're working with have their methods too. And we are both studying one another. And our knowledge actually grows from that conversation of mutually studying one another.
Isso quer dizer que se nós temos nossos métodos, as pessoas que estudamos também têm os seus métodos. E nós estamos estudando uns aos outros, na verdade. As nossas compreensões dos métodos deles, eles compreendendo os nossos.
So I think we need to rethink methods in a way that stresses the mutuality of the conversation rather than as something that we do to them.
Então, a gente precisa repensar o método estressando essa conversa mútua e não imaginando que o método é algo que nós fazemos a ele, daquelas pessoas que nós estudamos.
Which all anthropologists will understand.
Antropólogos entendem.
Rodrigo's question is about innovation. Innovation is a concept I don't really like. I prefer the concept of improvisation, which is quite different. And the reason I don't like innovation is that the focus of the word is on novelty rather than renewal. it's about setting ends to things rather than creating new beginnings.
Just a second. Então, em questão da relação do Rodrigo sobre inovação, inovação é um conceito que o Tim não gosta. Ele prefere a ideia de improviso, que é diferente. A razão que ele não gosta da palavra inovação é que a inovação coloca o foco, o peso, na novidade e não na renovação. A inovação é sobre estabelecer meta e não sobre estabelecer novos começos.
Because you can only decide whether something is an innovation or not by comparing it to what went before. So it means you have to look back. So here's one thing, and you look back at something else and say, this is new compared with that. But if you actually enter into the process of moving forward, then you're all the time trying to find a way through, which is not about innovating, but about improvising a passage.
Então, só dá para nós decidirmos se algo é uma inovação quando a gente compara esse algo ao que veio antes. Então, a gente tem que sempre olhar para trás, dizer que isso é novo em comparação àquilo. Mas se nós entrarmos no processo, se nós engajarmos no processo de irmos à frente, então nós estamos sempre tentando atravessar ou improvisar uma passagem.
Ok.
Thank you, Tim. Vamos ouvir agora o Radamés.
Olá, bom dia. Muito obrigado pela apresentação. Eu sou Radamés Villagomes, da Universidade Nacional Autônoma do México. E, no mesmo sentido que a pergunta de Rodrigo, se inovação é um termo que a gente não gosta e prefere improvisação, como explicar a noção de improvisação em relação aos ritmos? Quer dizer, improvisação implicaria, em alguma medida, a interrupção dos ritmos, pelo menos em algum momento, é somente um estado de aprofundamento nas coisas, no compromisso com as coisas. Eu estou interessado nesta noção de interrupção dos ritmos, pelo menos momentaneamente. Então, é isso. Muito obrigado.
This is Radamés of the Autonomous University of Mexico, and he's following on from Rodrigo's question, and he's saying if innovation is a term that we don't like and we prefer the term improvisation, then how would we go about explaining improvisation in rhythm? Does it imply the interruption of rhythm? Does improvisation imply the interruption of rhythm, or does it imply a deeper engagement with things and with rhythm? He's interested in this matter of the interruption of rhythm and what it might imply to your.
Okay, let's add one more question. Guilherme.
Ok. Obrigado, Tim, pela excelente conferência. Eu tenho uma questão pontual e também vou trazer uma outra questão que vem do público. Tá? Essa concepção anatômica de corpo que você busca fugir, de algum modo, ela também acaba por desconsiderar o papel dos objetos técnicos enquanto mediadores da percepção humana, né? Eu gostaria de saber como você vê essa relação entre objetos técnicos e percepção, mais particularmente como você enxerga essa possibilidade de consciência áptica mediada pelos objetos digitais. E aí...
Melhor, talvez, o Luiz traduzir, né? Depois vem para a segunda.
Perfeito.
So Danny has one question, and then he's going to bring a question from people following us on YouTube. First is this anatomic conception of the body that you seek to break free from. Perhaps it ignores the role of technical objects as mediators in perception, and he wants to know how you see this relation between technical objects and perception, and how haptic conscious would work, particularly in relation, if I'm not mistaken, Guilherme, I think technological innovations like the internet, is that what you mean? Essa última parte eu não peguei, Guilherme, desculpa, se você puder repetir. Você falou da consciência áptica como...
Tá sem áudio, Guilherme, está mutado.
Desculpa, a consciência áptica mediada pelos objetos digitais.
Ok. So he's about haptic conscience as mediated by digital objects.
E agora a segunda questão, né, Guilherme?
Ok. A segunda questão é da professora Letícia Cesarino, que eu vou transmitir do chat. Em resumo, ela pergunta se o hábito humano não pode estar sintonizado com o ritmo das máquinas cibernéticas.
So Letícia Cesarino of the University of Santa Catarina asks you whether a human habit might not be attuned to the rhythm of cybernetic machines.
Okay. You can go on if you want, Tim, when you want.
Okay, I'm just making a note of the question.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Radames, is that the right way to pronounce it? That question, your question was about improvisation in relation to rhythm, and whether if you're involved in rhythmic improvisation, whether that entails some form of interruption. I don't think so. I like the idea of inflection, and that's an idea that I take from Erin Manning, where she says that inflection is not a movement, it's about the way in which movement moves.
Em relação à pergunta do Radamés sobre se a improvisação rítmica exige algum tipo de interrupção, o Tim acha que não. Ele gosta de usar a ideia de inflexão, que é uma ideia que ele pega emprestado do Erin Manning, que diz que a inflexão não é um movimento, mas é sobre como o movimento se move.
Because if I'm involved in a musical performance, if I'm following what another player is doing and then improvising in response to that, it means that my movement is continually attuned and responsive to my listening of the other player. And you can't have rhythm without that kind of attunement and responsiveness. So if rhythm is a movement, then changes in rhythm in response to what another player is doing is an inflection in that movement, not an interruption.
Just a second.
Oh, sorry.
Então, porque ele pega o exemplo, se ele está envolvido, se ele está participando de uma performance musical e ele segue o que o outro músico faz, ele improvisa em resposta ao que o outro músico está fazendo, então o movimento dele está em sintonia com e responde à maneira como ele escuta o outro músico, que ele está ouvindo do outro músico. Então não há ritmo se esse tipo de jogo de atenção e resposta não estiver colocado. Então, se o ritmo é movimento, então as mudanças no ritmo em resposta ao que o outro músico faz são inflexões e não interrupções.
Okay, and then Guilherme's question was about technical objects as mediators of perception, whether hapticality is mediated by digital objects. And the answer is yes and no. It depends on what we mean by mediation. Because yes, clearly a technical object can come in between the perceiver and what is perceived, like a telescope or something like that, or a microscope. It clearly affects what one perceives, and yet the perception is still direct in the Gibsonian sense of direct perception, which I would have to explain.
Before you explain.
Yes.
Em relação à resposta do Guilherme, sobre os objetos técnicos como mediadores da percepção e o lugar dos objetos digitais. A resposta seria sim e não, que depende da definição de mediação. Então, sim, um objeto técnico pode entrar ou ficar entre, né, o perceptor e aquilo que é percebido. Um telescópio, por exemplo, um microscópio, interfere naquilo que percebemos. Mas a percepção também segue sendo direta no sentido do Gibson. E aí, acho que vai ter que explicar o que isso quer dizer.
Okay, because Gibson argues against the cognitivist view that perception means constructing a picture in one's head of what is out there in the world on the basis of the input of sensory stimuli. He says rather that we detect patterns, we can perceive the world directly by detecting invariance patterns in the stimulus array. And you can do that even if your perception is mediated by objects. So the perception is still direct, even though it's mediated.
Então, para o James Gibson, ele argumenta contra ele tem um argumento contra a visão cognitiva de que a percepção envolve construir uma imagem mental daquilo que existe no mundo por meio do insumo de estímulos sensoriais. Então, ao contrário, Gibson argumenta, nós detectamos padrões e percebemos invariantes diretamente no campo dos estímulos. E nós podemos fazer isso mesmo se a nossa percepção for mediada por objeto. Então, a percepção segue sendo direta, mesmo que mediada.
Then the question about digital objects, I think the answer to this depends on the principles of design that are embodied in these objects. That most design in the digital area, like the design of this laptop that I'm using, is actually determined to block hapticality. But that doesn't mean that digitization necessarily blocks hapticality.
Então, sobre os objetos digitais, a resposta a isso depende dos princípios de design incorporados nesses objetos, né, que estão incorporados, embodied nesses objetos. A maioria dos designs na era digitais, como o design do laptop dele, do computador dele, são feitos, na verdade, para bloquear a hapticalidade. Mas isso não quer dizer que a digitalização necessariamente precisa bloquear a hapticalidade.
So you could imagine you could design a digital pen that would enhance your sensory contact with the paper when you write by hand. And that would be a very haptic kind of digitalization. But mostly the design of digital technologies has worked in the other direction to reduce the haptic element to a minimum. So it is a question about design rather than about digitization in itself.
Então, pode-se desenhar uma caneta digital, por exemplo, que aumenta o contato sensorial que nós temos com o papel quando escrevemos à mão. Isso seria uma digitalização áptica. Mas, de modo geral, os designs de objetos digitais foram na direção oposta, reduzindo ao mínimo o elemento áptico. Mas ele acha que, então, o problema não está no digital, mas sim no design. É uma questão de design, não algo inerente ao digital.
And then that last question, whether human habit could be attuned to the rhythm of a cybernetic machine, that's an interesting question, and I think it could be reformulated in a different way. The question would be, can a machine have habits? And I haven't asked myself that question before, and it's a really interesting question. And I'm not sure what the answer is, because it comes down to this question of where we draw the boundary between a human and a machine, or whether we can draw such a boundary at all. But it's possible that if we think of a machine in a very generous way, then then perhaps a machine could have habits too, as much as we do.
Então, a última questão é interessante. Ele acha que ela pode ser reformulada da seguinte maneira. Uma máquina pode ter hábitos? Ele nunca se fez essa pergunta e ela é muito interessante. Ele não sabe ao certo qual seria a resposta. Em certa medida, a resposta dependeria de onde nós vamos colocar a fronteira entre o humano e a máquina. E se nós podemos colocar essa fronteira de todo. Então, é possível, se a gente for pensar numa máquina de modo generoso, talvez seja possível imaginar que a máquina tenha hábitos, como a gente.
Ok. Thank you, Ingold. Eu vou fazer, então, uma última questão, né? Não temos mais inscritos. E eu vou pedir, então, para o Ingold respondê-la e já fazer um comentário final, né? Como um admirador e leitor da sua obra, eu me dou a liberdade de visualizar na sua trajetória alguns paralelos, um paralelo importante entre a sua abordagem e a abordagem do Mauss e do Leroy-Gourhan. Isso aparece em alguns momentos. Não sei se você quer traduzir essa primeira parte, Luiz, e depois eu continuo.
Então, Carlos is going to put a final question. We're going to ask you to answer and then to make a final comment as you wish. So, as a long-time admirer of your work, Carlos allows himself to see certain parallels in your own trajectory and that of Mauss and Leroy-Gourhan and their approaches as well.
Tanto o Mauss quanto o Leroy-Gourhan consideram o olhar sobre a técnica, quer dizer, a relação com objetos, com animais, com plantas e com o meio, como um tema da maior relevância para a antropologia compreender o mundo em que eles viviam na época. Quer dizer, o entre guerras e depois o período da Guerra Fria, no caso do Leroy-Gourhan, né? E é possível ver nisso um duplo engajamento. Um engajamento prático do pesquisador com o que ele pesquisa, que é possível ver no texto sobre as técnicas do corpo e em todo o método do Leroy-Gourhan, mas também um engajamento, digamos, podemos chamar de político, com a situação vivida naqueles momentos. Esses dois engajamentos parecem estar diretamente associados nas obras desses autores, e eu vejo isso também na obra do Ingold, queria saber se ele concorda com isso, né? Então, essa é a primeira questão. E se ele concorda, a questão é rápida, a segunda, Luiz, é só, se ele concorda, eu pediria para ele fazer um comentário sobre a relação entre o que ele apresentou hoje e as reflexões que ele tem feito ultimamente sobre o papel da antropologia no mundo atual. Qual seria a conexão entre essas duas coisas? Enfim, essa é a questão.
Então, so what he sees is that both Mauss and Leroy-Gourhan, I mean, they consider that their view of technique and the relations with animals and technology in general, relations with animals and plants and their medium, as a way for anthropologists to understand the world at the time in which they were living, in the interwar years. So there's a sort of double engagement in their work of the researcher engaging with what he studies, but also we might call it a political engagement of their lived situation. Both are closely associated in the work of these authors, and Carlos suggests that it may be present in your own work as well, Tim. And he says that if you agree with this, he asks you to please comment on the relation between what you presented today and the role of anthropology in the contemporary world.
Just a little question. So yes, I think, I hope that there's a relationship between what I'm trying to say here and my view of anthropology in the contemporary world. And in that, the view of anthropology, my view of anthropology is that it is a generous, open-ended, comparative, and yet critical inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of life in the one world we all inhabit. That's my definition of anthropology. And that means that we are inquiring into what the possibilities of life might be. And what makes anthropology different from just about every other academic discipline is that we are actually prepared to learn from not only what other people are telling us, but also what things and stuff and materials and objects and the world is telling us too.
Então, uma pequena questão apenas, ele brincou, e ele espera que haja de fato uma relação entre o que ele fala aqui e a visão dele da antropologia no mundo contemporâneo, no sentido de que a visão dele da antropologia é que ela é um inquérito, né, comparativo, generoso, das condições de vida no mundo em que todos nós habitamos, né? Seria a definição dele da antropologia. Nós nos perguntamos, nós antropólogos, sobre quais seriam as possibilidades da vida. E o que faz a antropologia diferir de quase todas as outras disciplinas acadêmicas é que nós aprendemos não só daquilo ou com aquilo que as pessoas nos dizem, mas também de objetos, de animais, de plantas, dos lugares onde vivem, das coisas, de modo geral.
So for me, it's a way of, we're asking philosophical questions about being, knowing, remembering, learning, and so on, but we're asking them through or by way of an engagement, not just with other scholarly texts, but with people and things and the world we live in, so that the whole world becomes a place of study. That, I think, is what anthropology should be, but I am sometimes a bit disappointed when I see what anthropology actually is at the moment.
Então, a antropologia é um meio de fazer perguntas filosóficas sobre aprender, sobre recordar, lembrar, etc., mas por meio de um engajamento não apenas com outros textos acadêmicos, mas também com pessoas, com coisas e com o mundo no qual vivemos. Né? O mundo inteiro é um lugar e para o estudo. É isso que ele acha que a antropologia deveria ser, mas ele se decepciona às vezes quando ele se depara com aquilo que a antropologia hoje de fato é.
Ok.
Ok, Tim, thank you. Bom, vamos nos encaminhar então para encerrar essa belíssima conferência, com a qual a gente termina o ciclo de conferências desse evento. Ainda teremos uma sessão de trabalho à tarde, mas eu queria então, em nome de todos os participantes do evento, das pessoas que nos acompanham no chat, agradecer imensamente ao Tim pela disponibilidade de vir nos apresentar, enfim, algo que ele ainda vai publicar nos próximos meses e discutir de forma tão franca e aberta e engajada como é hábito no time, todos esses temas. E, sobretudo, agradecer pela contribuição que ele deu hoje, mas que ele vem dando nas últimas décadas, sobretudo para os temas que nos interessam aqui particularmente, que são os temas da técnica e da vida. Né? Ele é um autor fundamental e, enfim, por essa razão, estamos muito felizes de poder engajar com ele aqui hoje. Então, muito obrigado, Tim. Luiz?
Carlos would like to close this wonderful conference, beautiful conference, remind everyone that we still have a workshop this afternoon. And in the name of all the participants and all those who are following us in the chat, we'd like to thank Tim for presenting to us today what he will soon publish in the coming months, and to discuss with us in an open manner, as is habitual with you, Tim, these issues here with us. And to thank you, not only for today's contributions, but for the many contributions that you have been giving us over many decades on life and technique on these issues that we study.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay. I wish you well for the rest of your conference.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Obrigado a todos.